Amara had always felt different even as a child. While other children ran clumsily across the village fields, struggling with the uneven ground or the mud that clung to their feet after rain, she seemed to float effortlessly, her movements light and graceful, as if gravity itself bent to her will. From the earliest age she had known the exhilarating freedom of flight. On mornings when the sky was painted with the soft pinks and golds of dawn, she would rise above the thatched rooftops, her bare feet lifting from the ground, her hair streaming behind her like sunlight captured in motion. The villagers often paused to watch her, some in admiration, others in suspicion, as she soared with a natural ease that seemed almost otherworldly. She could glide over the river that wound lazily through the valley, feel the wind curl around her arms, and dip and twist in the air with a freedom that no bird could match. Her laughter, carried on the breeze, became a familiar sound, echoing from the hillsides and through the alleys of the village, a reminder that someone among them had been touched by something extraordinary. Amara's family adored her. Her parents, humble yet loving, marveled at her gift as though it were a blessing from the spirits themselves. They had nurtured her abilities carefully, never trying to confine her or diminish the wonder in her eyes. Her younger siblings followed her often, clumsily imitating her leaps and spins, giggling when they fell or stumbled, and cheering when she swooped low enough to scoop them into a brief, playful flight. Within the walls of their home, laughter and pride mixed freely. Her parents would often recount stories of their ancestors, tales of daring and courage, and they would emphasize that Amara's gift was rare, perhaps a manifestation of the strength and resilience that ran through their family line. Her mother would smooth her hair after long flights and whisper, "You were born to touch the skies, Amara, and your spirit is stronger than even the highest clouds." Her father, often watching her climb effortlessly to the treetops, would shake his head in wonder and mutter, "No cage, no fear can ever hold you. You are the wind itself." To them, her wings, though invisible to the eye in the literal sense, were tangible in the way she moved, the way she breathed, the way she made the world around her feel lighter and more alive. Yet, not everyone shared in this admiration. The village elders, cloaked in authority and tradition, observed Amara's flights with a growing unease. They whispered among themselves when they thought she could not hear, casting wary glances as she soared higher than any previous generation had ever dared. They feared what they did not understand, and in Amara they saw power too great, too untamed, too threatening to remain unchecked. Some elders murmured of omens, of spirits that might favor the girl too much, or of the consequences if such power were allowed to flourish unchecked. They felt envy too, tinged with the bitterness of their own aging bodies and diminishing abilities. They feared the freedom that Amara represented, the hope and inspiration she embodied, and they feared that one day the villagers themselves might turn toward her instead of venerating the established order. The elders convened in their shadowed halls, debating how to restrain a gift they could neither claim nor control, and they watched her each day with a mixture of suspicion, anxiety, and a grudging respect they could never openly admit. Amara herself remained blissfully unaware of their plotting. Her heart was filled with the joy of flight, her mind soaring as high as her body, lost in the sensation of wind against skin and sunlight dancing across the fields. Every leap and glide was an affirmation of her connection to the skies, a celebration of freedom that no earthbound fear could diminish. She trained herself to twist, to dive, to float effortlessly, and to understand the currents of air that carried her higher than any tree or hill. The village children followed her example with clumsy determination, and even some adults found themselves captivated by the purity of her joy. It was not only her ability to fly that drew attention, but the courage and grace with which she moved, the radiant light of confidence and fearlessness that seemed to shine from her very being. To those who cherished freedom, Amara was a living testament to what could be achieved when one dared to embrace their true nature. The bond she shared with her family strengthened with every passing day. Meals were prepared with care before and after her flights, evenings were spent recounting tales of distant lands she imagined flying to, and her siblings' laughter became a soundtrack to the endless skies she navigated. She was their pride, their hope, their living miracle, yet she remained humble and kind, never flaunting her abilities except to inspire, to lift spirits, and to remind everyone that the impossible might sometimes simply be waiting for courage and belief to meet it. Even as the elders whispered and plotted in secret, Amara's days were filled with light, air, and joy, unaware that the envy and fear simmering just beyond the horizon would one day try to ground her permanently. But for now, she soared higher than the tallest trees, freer than the wildest river currents, and untouched by the darkness that lingered silently beneath the surface of the village she called home. The morning was thick with an unnatural stillness, a silence that seemed to press down on the village as if even the wind had been warned to hold its breath. Amara stretched her arms wide, preparing for her usual flight, the exhilaration bubbling in her chest as she felt the familiar pull of air currents beneath her. But as she stepped into the clearing beyond the village, she noticed the elders gathered in solemn formation, their dark robes contrasting sharply with the soft sunlight that dappled the grass. At their center stood her stepmother, her expression unreadable, a veil of false concern draping over her features. The moment Amara's gaze met theirs, a chill ran down her spine, a premonition of the cruelty to come. "Amara," her stepmother called, her voice smooth and persuasive, "we have a ceremony today. A tradition to honor your gift, to ensure the spirits continue to favor you in our village." Her words sounded sweet, yet they rang hollow, a warning masked in warmth. Amara, trusting and unassuming, approached, her feet light on the soft earth. She had been raised to honor rituals, to respect the elders, and to believe that their guidance, however strict, came from wisdom. She did not yet sense the malice in the carefully orchestrated event. The elders began chanting softly, forming a circle around her. Amara raised her arms, preparing to soar, thinking this would be a ceremonial flight to showcase her abilities and bless the village. But as the chant grew louder, the air seemed to thicken, resisting her movements. The wind that had always welcomed her now felt stifled, heavy, almost hostile. She flapped her arms instinctively, attempting to rise, but the lift she had taken for granted faltered. Something was wrong. The elders' eyes were fixed on her with a mixture of fear and determination, their whispers weaving into the chant, shaping it into a binding force she could not yet understand. Her stepmother approached, holding a strange ritual blade, its surface polished to a sinister gleam. "Do not be afraid, Amara," she said, her tone carefully soothing. "This is for your own good. To protect you from the forces you do not yet understand." But Amara's heart sank. The blade, the tension in the elder's posture, the unnatural stillness of the wind, it all collided in her mind, a horrifying realization blooming. Her wings, her freedom, her very essence, were about to be taken. As the ritual commenced, the elders surrounded her, chanting with a rhythm designed to suppress her abilities. Amara struggled, flapping, twisting, and pushing against the invisible chains that gripped her spirit. But the more she resisted, the more oppressive the air became. She felt a sharp, searing pain as the ritual blade came into contact with her wings, clipping them, breaking the currents of energy that had always lifted her effortlessly. Shock and agony coursed through her body as the wings she had taken for granted, the wings that had defined her very identity, were grounded forcibly. She fell to the earth, hitting the grass hard, the sunlight suddenly seeming harsh and accusing. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to rise, to summon the wind, to reclaim the freedom that had been ripped from her. But the elders' ritual had succeeded. The currents that had always responded to her now recoiled at her touch. She was bound to the earth, her limbs shaking, her spirit reeling from betrayal and loss. Her stepmother stood nearby, her expression a mask of feigned sorrow, yet Amara could feel the coldness in her eyes, the satisfaction hidden behind every calculated gesture. The elders, satisfied with their work, dispersed slowly, leaving Amara in the clearing. The sunlight now seemed harsh, blinding in its normalcy, mocking her helplessness. The wind whispered faintly around her, a reminder of what she had lost, brushing against her hair as if mourning with her, yet powerless to lift her into the skies. Alone and grounded, Amara curled into herself, grief pressing on her chest like a physical weight. The freedom she had known, the joy of flight, and the exhilaration of soaring above the world, all stripped away in a single cruel act. As she lay on the earth, staring up at the clouds she could no longer reach, a spark of defiance began to kindle within her. They had taken her wings, yes, but her spirit was not yet broken. Somewhere deep inside, beyond the pain and the betrayal, she knew that she would not remain grounded forever. The world was vast, and though the elders and her stepmother had clipped her wings, they could not yet cage her courage, her ingenuity, or her will to rise. The day had been dark, her freedom stolen, yet a seed of determination had been planted, a seed that would, in time, grow into the power to soar higher than ever before. Amara's world had shrunk to the confines of a tall, narrow tower perched on the edge of the village, its stone walls cold and unyielding. The elders had chosen this place deliberately, isolated, hidden from the eyes of curious villagers, and far from the winds that had once carried her effortlessly into the sky. Every morning she awoke to the same dim light filtering through a high, narrow window, a reminder of the freedom she had lost. The tower's interior was sparse, a simple cot in one corner, a worn wooden table and little else. The air smelled faintly of damp stone and dust, the kind that seemed to cling to clothes, hair, and even skin. Amara's wings, clipped and broken, ached constantly, a dull throb of loss and betrayal that reminded her at every moment of the power that had been stolen. Days blended into nights in the tower, each indistinguishable from the last. She wandered from wall to wall, tracing the cracks in the stones with her fingers, letting her mind drift into memories of flight. She could still feel the wind brushing past her, the rush of air lifting her higher than the tallest trees, the exhilaration of weightless movement. But now, each thought of soaring brought a sharp pang of sorrow and frustration. She banged her fists against the walls at times, hoping for an echo to respond, for the wind to rush in and lift her up, but only the hollow sound of stone answered. The isolation pressed in on her from all sides, wrapping her in a blanket of despair so thick it threatened to smother the spark of hope she clung to. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the tower was bathed in orange and violet light, Amara noticed something she had overlooked in her restless pacing: the walls themselves. Faint carvings etched into the stone caught the dying sunlight in strange patterns. She knelt close, tracing her fingers over the grooves, feeling the depth and care with which they had been made. Symbols she did not understand mingled with words and scripts long forgotten, names that seemed to echo from the past. Her curiosity overcame her sorrow, and she began to explore every inch of the tower walls, discovering more carvings hidden in shadowed corners, tucked behind old beams, or just faintly scratched into the stone. As she traced the carvings, a story began to emerge. The marks were left by others before her: children, women, and men who had been punished for gifts that frightened the elders. There were drawings of wings, tiny and fragile, similar to hers, scratched deep into the stone by hands desperate to leave a trace. There were symbols of eyes, of hearts, of flames, all carefully etched, hinting at abilities too extraordinary or too dangerous for the village's rigid order. Names accompanied the symbols, sometimes with dates, sometimes with short pleas: "Do not forget me, the wind is my friend, they cannot clip what is inside me." Each carving was a silent testament to resilience and defiance, a bridge across generations of those who had been silenced, grounded, or punished for the very gifts that made them extraordinary. Amara's heart raced as she realized she was not alone in her suffering. The tower, once a prison, now whispered to her through these messages left in stone. Each name, each symbol, carried a voice, a story, a warning, and a spark of hope. She began to understand that the elders' cruelty had always been met with quiet rebellion, that those who had come before had found ways to resist in small yet profound ways. She pressed her ear to the wall, imagining the spirits of the gifted whispering across time, encouraging her to endure, to find strength even in the darkest moments. Night after night, she studied the carvings, memorizing their forms, tracing the patterns with her fingertips, and letting the messages fill her mind. She drew her own sketches, tiny winged figures and symbols of rising, connecting her story to theirs. The tower's walls, once oppressively bare, became a canvas of defiance, a tapestry woven by generations who refused to let fear or cruelty erase their existence. Amara began to feel her despair lift, replaced by a cautious hope. The gift that had been taken from her had not vanished. The carvings reminded her that power is not always physical, that the spirit and the mind hold their own wings, and that freedom can be found even in confinement. As she lay on her cot each night, staring at the ceiling, she no longer felt entirely trapped. The carvings were a guide, a map of courage, a silent counsel from those who had endured before. She realized that her flight could be more than a leap into the sky. It could be a rise beyond fear, beyond oppression, beyond the limitations imposed by others. The tower was a prison, yes, but it was also a classroom, a sanctuary, and a source of wisdom. With every name she memorized, with every symbol she understood, Amara's resolve hardened. She would endure. She would rise. And though her wings had been clipped, her spirit would find a way to soar. As night fell over the village, the tower became a world of shadows and silence, broken only by the occasional creak of old beams or the soft sigh of the wind outside. The sunlight had disappeared hours before, leaving the small chamber dim and cold. Amara curled on her cot, her back pressed against the rough stone wall, trying to calm the ache in her heart and the dull throb where her wings had once been. Sleep was elusive, her mind restless, replaying memories of soaring through the sky, feeling the currents beneath her and the freedom that had been stolen. The isolation pressed down on her like a weight, yet in the quiet darkness, something began to stir. A faint sound came first, almost imperceptible, a gentle rustle that seemed to move through the cracks in the tower walls. At first, she thought it was the wind outside brushing against the stone, but there was something different about it. It carried a rhythm, a whisper, delicate yet insistent, curling through the room like a living presence. Amara's eyes widened as she sat up, straining to listen. The sound seemed to speak directly to her, a voice carried on the breath of air itself, gentle and melodic, yet urgent and full of meaning. She could not see its source, yet she felt its presence as clearly as if someone had stood at her side, guiding her. The whisper spoke in words, fragments at first, fleeting glimpses of meaning. You are not alone. The sky is within you. Rise beyond what they clip. Amara's heart thudded as she realized that these were messages meant for her, encouragements from some unseen force, a voice born of the wind itself. She pressed her palms to the cold stones, willing the sensation to deepen, willing the whisper to speak more clearly. And it did. Slowly, unmistakably, the wind carried stories of those who had been trapped, silenced, or grounded, and yet had found ways to overcome, to rise despite every attempt to keep them low. There was a voice of a girl who had once been forbidden from singing, whose melodies had been silenced by jealous elders. She had learned to hum through the currents of water, letting her song travel unseen through rivers and streams. Another voice spoke of a boy whose hands had been bound, his craft stolen, yet who built secret machines that flew in secret, whispering messages of ingenuity and perseverance. The wind seemed to carry hundreds of such stories, each layered over the other, forming a tapestry of courage and defiance. Amara listened, enraptured, feeling their strength intertwine with her own sorrow and frustration, filling her with a sense of purpose she had not known she possessed. Night after night the wind returned. At first, it was just faint murmurs, brushing past her ears, teasing her with fragments of guidance. Gradually, the messages became clearer, more intentional, almost like a conversation. The wind taught her patience, resilience, and creativity. It suggested ways to sense the currents of the world even without her wings, ways to harness energy and movement in ways she had never considered. The sky is not only above you, it whispered. It is around you, within you, beyond the boundaries they impose. You can rise without them, if you learn to listen and trust what lives inside you. Amara began to anticipate these nightly visits. She would pace the narrow floor of the tower, listening for the first stir of the air, closing her eyes, letting the voices flow into her. She memorized their lessons, practiced small movements inspired by their guidance, and imagined herself soaring even while grounded. The stories were vivid, each spirit's struggle a mirror to her own, each solution a spark to her imagination. In the quiet hours she whispered back, answering the wind with her own thoughts, forming a dialogue that strengthened her resolve. The air seemed to vibrate in response, carrying her words outward, intertwining her presence with the countless others who had overcome oppression in silence. The whispers did more than teach her skills or give advice. They reignited a fire of hope that she had thought extinguished. Amara realized that even without her wings she was not powerless. The spirits' voices reminded her that true strength was not bound to flesh and feathers alone, but to courage, ingenuity, and belief. Each night, as she lay on her cot, she no longer felt like a prisoner. She felt like a student of the unseen, learning to move in ways the elders could not understand, growing stronger with every lesson carried by the wind. By the time the moon had risen high, spilling silver light through the narrow window, Amara could sense a change within herself. The despair that had weighed her down now mingled with determination and anticipation. She felt the wind inside her veins, whispering of freedom, of power beyond what had been clipped, of heights she had not yet dared to imagine. And as she drifted into a restless sleep, she knew with certainty that she would not remain grounded forever. The spirits had chosen her to listen, to learn, and to rise, and in the hours of darkness, they had given her the first true glimpse of the flight that awaited her beyond the tower walls. Amara awoke one morning to a pale gray light filtering through the narrow tower window, casting long shadows across the cold stone walls. The whispers on the wind had become a steady presence, a chorus of encouragement and guidance that filled the corners of her mind and heart. For weeks she had listened, learned, and followed the advice carried by the currents, practicing movements that mimicked flight, stretching and bending her body as if she could convince the air to lift her without the wings she had lost. At first her efforts seemed futile. She could not rise beyond a few inches before collapsing to the floor, her clipped wings useless, her muscles aching with frustration. But the spirits' voices, gentle yet insistent, reminded her that power was not always visible and that the most profound abilities often lay hidden within. Slowly she began to understand. Flight was not only a matter of physical wings or strength. It was a harmony of body, mind, and spirit. She realized that she had relied too heavily on the wings themselves, assuming that they alone defined her freedom. Now, with them gone, she was forced to explore other ways to rise, other ways to harness the currents of energy that surrounded her. She spent hours meditating in the tower, closing her eyes and imagining herself aloft, feeling her body lighten with every breath, imagining the air bending around her in response to her intent. The whispers encouraged her, reminding her of her ancestors, of those who had defied limits and constraints, of those who had discovered new paths when old ones were blocked. Amara began to experiment. She ran along the narrow tower floor, leaping and twirling, pushing herself higher with each jump, letting her imagination guide the movement of her body. She extended her arms wide, imagining them as wings of energy, feeling the air resist and yield to her focus. Sometimes she would fall heavily to the ground, bruised and frustrated, but she no longer saw failure as defeat. Every attempt, every small lift, was a step toward understanding the hidden power within her, a step toward reclaiming the freedom that had been stolen. She began to notice that when she combined movement with intent and focus, the air seemed to respond, subtle at first, gentle lifts that hinted at the possibility of true flight. The tower itself seemed to become a participant in her growth. The stones whispered with the echoes of past occupants, the carvings she had discovered now serving as a map of resilience and ingenuity. She drew inspiration from them, tracing their forms in her mind, letting their stories guide her movements. She realized that the world outside, even the smallest details, the rustle of leaves, the pattern of the wind through the trees, the shifting currents of air, could become allies in her ascent. Flight was no longer a simple act of wings flapping. It was a dance with the world itself, a partnership between her body, her mind, and the forces that had always surrounded her. Amara began to notice subtle changes in herself. Her muscles, once relying on wings, grew stronger and more flexible in different ways. Her balance improved as she learned to use her core and legs to push against the ground and channel energy upward. Her focus sharpened, her awareness of currents, pressure, and wind increasing with every experiment. Most importantly, she felt her spirit expand, filling with a confidence and determination that no physical clipping could suppress. She began to understand that the elders had underestimated her completely. They had taken her wings, yes, but they had not touched the essence of her being, the source of her courage and creativity, the wellspring of her indomitable will. In the quiet hours of the night, she would practice stretching, jumping, and twirling in the moonlight that poured through the tower window. The whispers guided her hand, eye, and body in tandem, teaching her how to harness motion and intention together. She imagined herself soaring over valleys, mountains, and rivers, imagining the wind carrying her higher than she had ever flown before, not through wings but through sheer alignment with the world around her. Her mind became a map, her body a conduit, and the air itself a partner. She discovered that she could manipulate currents subtly, using energy and movement to lift herself fraction by fraction, inch by inch, until the sensation of rising became real, tangible, and exhilarating. Amara also began to realize that her strength was not solely personal, it was collective. She drew on the stories of those who had been silenced and grounded before her, channeling their courage and ingenuity into her own efforts. The whispers on the wind were not just instructions, they were voices of empowerment, reminders that her journey was part of a continuum of defiance and liberation. She learned that flight could be an act of creation, a method of transformation, and a statement of unbreakable will. By the end of the 7th day of intense practice, she could rise several feet without assistance, her movements fluid and purposeful. Her clipped wings no longer felt like a limitation but a symbol of the power she had discovered within herself. The tower, once a prison, had become a laboratory of strength and ingenuity. Amara realized fully that freedom was not given. It was claimed, forged from resilience, creativity, and an unwavering connection to the world around her. And in that realization, the first true sense of soaring filled her, a lift not of flesh alone but of spirit, mind, and the unseen currents that had always carried her forward. The tower had become a sanctuary of discovery, a place where Amara's spirit had learned to stretch beyond the confines of her clipped wings. Each day she honed her control over her body, mind, and intent, feeling the currents of the world around her as though they were threads she could tug and shape. Yet, despite the progress she had made, she still longed for the sensation of true flight, the rush of air beneath her, the exhilaration of leaving the ground entirely. She dreamed of the skies she had once known, their infinite expanse calling to her like a distant song. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the horizon in streaks of crimson and gold, she sensed a change in the air. The winds outside the tower whispered differently, carrying a vibration she could feel deep in her chest. It started subtly, a breeze that seemed to respond to her thoughts, brushing against her cheeks as if acknowledging her intent. Amara closed her eyes and extended her arms, imagining herself lifted, imagining the currents bending around her in welcome. The air shifted, stronger now, brushing past her with purposeful direction. A shiver ran through her body, a mixture of anticipation and disbelief, as she realized that nature itself was beginning to answer her call. She took a cautious step, lifted herself on her toes, and felt a gentle upward tug from the ground. Her heart raced as her mind aligned with the rhythm of the wind, her intent fusing with the currents surrounding her. Day after day she experimented with this newfound connection. Gusts of wind responded to her movements, sometimes pushing her forward, sometimes lifting her slightly off the ground. She learned to sense the subtleties of the currents, how a small shift of her hand or a tilt of her head could change the direction and strength of the air. The tower, the open courtyard below, the surrounding forests, they all seemed to hum with energy, waiting for her to tap into their latent power. Each attempt became a dialogue with the elements, her body a conductor of the invisible orchestra around her. One night, during a particularly fierce storm, the wind howled around the tower with a strength she had never experienced. Rain pelted the stones and whipped through the open window, but Amara did not retreat. Instead, she stepped into the gusts, letting them wrap around her, letting the air itself become a partner in her ascent. She felt currents lift her slightly as if the wind were testing her, measuring her intent, and responding to the courage she projected. Every movement she made, every leap, twist, and reach, was amplified by the storm, pushing her higher than she had ever risen within the confines of the tower. As the days progressed, her control strengthened. She discovered that she could coax air currents to spiral beneath her feet, forming a temporary cushion of lift. She could direct gusts to push her forward, to counteract gravity's pull, to carry her across the courtyard without touching the ground. Each success filled her with exhilaration, and the stormy nights became training grounds, her laboratory of air and energy. Her clipped wings no longer defined her limitations. The elements themselves had become extensions of her will, an invisible set of wings that could carry her wherever she imagined. Amara also realized that the elements were responsive to emotion as well as intent. When fear crept into her mind, the wind faltered, subtle but enough to remind her that control required clarity and focus. When joy, determination, and hope filled her heart, the currents strengthened, lifting her with almost magical grace. It was not the wings she had once relied upon that mattered now, but her connection to the world around her and the strength of her spirit. Each gust, each swirl of air, was a reminder that she could rise not by what had been taken from her but by what she had discovered within and around her. The villagers, watching from below, caught glimpses of her nightly ascents. At first, they mistook her movements for tricks or illusions, but as she grew bolder, rising higher and farther with each attempt, whispers of awe and disbelief spread through the village. Even the elders, who had thought to suppress her power permanently, were forced to acknowledge that she had found a way to defy their restrictions. Nature itself had become her ally, the sky a partner, and her body and mind the instruments through which this alliance manifested. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, Amara leapt from the tower ledge with confidence. The wind caught her instantly, swirling beneath her, lifting and spinning her in a dance of freedom. Rain droplets glimmered like jewels as she soared above the treetops, higher than she had dared in months, feeling exhilaration and power she had never known. Her clipped wings mattered no longer, she was carried by the elements themselves. For the first time since the elders had bound her, Amara truly flew again, not just physically but in spirit, mind, and soul. The rebellion of the elements had begun, and through her connection with nature, she discovered that no force could permanently hold down a spirit determined to rise. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew and earth as the sun began its slow climb over the horizon. Amara stood at the edge of the tower, her bare feet pressed against the rough stone, her heart pounding with anticipation. The weeks of isolation, the relentless practice, and the whispers of guidance she had received from the wind had all led to this moment. Today she would attempt something she had never done before. She would take her first true flight without her wings, relying entirely on the connection she had cultivated with the world around her and the hidden strength she had discovered within. The village below stirred with the usual early activity, unaware that history was about to unfold above them. The elders, however, had taken their positions in secret, watching from their hidden vantage points, convinced that she had been grounded forever, certain that their cruel measures had succeeded. They believed that the girl they had clipped had been broken, reduced to a powerless shadow of the extraordinary being she once was. But as Amara closed her eyes and lifted her arms to the sky, A calm determination filled her chest, quieting the lingering fear that had tried to cling to her spirit. She breathed deeply, inhaling the crisp morning air, feeling it swirl around her, sensing the currents, and feeling the subtle responses of the wind to her intent. Her body tensed, ready to leap, and then with a sudden surge of courage she pushed off the stone ledge. For a moment, gravity pulled at her, heavy and relentless, but she focused on the currents around her, on the invisible threads of air she had learned to manipulate. The wind responded as it had during her clandestine practices, swirling beneath her feet, lifting and twisting, buoyed by her resolve and the unseen power that had grown within her. Amara felt a thrill unlike anything she had known. She was no longer confined by her clipped wings, she was lifted by the partnership she had forged with the elements themselves. Each movement of her arms, each subtle shift of her weight, was amplified by the air, carrying her higher and farther than she could have imagined. The exhilaration coursed through her veins, a rush of freedom so pure that she laughed aloud, the sound echoing off the walls of the tower and across the village fields below. It was a laughter of triumph, of joy, and of liberation, a declaration that she could no longer be confined or controlled. As she rose above the treetops, the village below came into view. Children paused in their morning play, staring upward with mouths agape, while the adults whispered in awe, unsure whether what they were witnessing was magic or miracle. Even the elders, hidden in their observation points, could not hide their shock. Their eyes widened in disbelief as Amara twisted and spun effortlessly in the air, rising higher, her movements fluid and confident, guided by her will and the strength she had nurtured in the weeks of hardship. They had believed her grounded forever, powerless and broken, yet here she was, soaring higher than they had thought possible, untethered by the limitations they had imposed. The sky became her playground. She dipped and spiraled, riding the currents as if she were part of the wind itself. The wind seemed to embrace her, lifting her in sudden bursts, twirling her in arcs that made her heart race with exhilaration. Rain droplets from a light morning mist caught in the sunlight like tiny jewels as she passed through them, shimmering against her skin and adding to the sensation of flying higher than ever. Each maneuver, each lift, each twist was a testament to her ingenuity, courage, and determination. A victory not merely over physical constraints, but over the fear and envy that had tried to hold her down. Amara realized that her flight was not just a personal triumph. It was a message to the village, to the elders, and to anyone who had ever been silenced or oppressed. Freedom could not be clipped, courage could not be restrained, and the spirit could not be broken. The exhilaration she felt was intertwined with a profound sense of purpose. She had learned that flight was more than the act of soaring, it was the manifestation of inner strength, the courage to rise above adversity, and the refusal to be defined by what others sought to take from her. The wind carried her higher still, and for a moment she paused midair, arms spread wide, body lifted effortlessly. Below, the village seemed small, the elders' houses mere points among the trees, their authority diminished in the face of her power. Amara felt a wave of clarity and triumph wash over her. She was no longer merely a girl with clipped wings, she was a being who had discovered that freedom resides not in the physical, but in the spirit, in the mind, and in the courage to claim what is rightfully yours. As she descended gently back toward the tower, she felt a surge of confidence and exhilaration, knowing that this first true flight was only the beginning. The elders' fears, the stepmother's treachery, the isolation, they were no match for the hidden strength, ingenuity, and courage she had cultivated. Amara had soared not just with the wind, but with the power she had discovered within herself. And as the villagers looked up in awe, witnessing the impossible become reality, she knew with certainty that no force on earth could ever keep her grounded again. Amara had flown higher than she ever imagined possible, lifted not by wings but by the currents of air she had learned to command and the inner strength she had cultivated through weeks of hardship. Yet even in the exhilaration of flight, she sensed there was something more to her abilities, a truth that had yet to reveal itself. Landing softly on the tower ledge, she stood with the wind brushing her face, her heart still racing from the thrill of soaring above the village. For the first time she paused to reflect, to feel the depth of what she had achieved, and to consider what it truly meant to be powerful. The weeks of isolation, the stolen wings, and the silent whispers of the tower had all led her to this moment of clarity. She realized that the wings themselves, the ones the elders had clipped in fear, had never been the source of her strength. They had been a symbol, a visible representation of what she had always possessed within: courage, resilience, and the capacity to rise despite the forces determined to keep her grounded. Her body could be constrained, her flight clipped, but her spirit, the essence of who she was, remained untouchable. It was a revelation that struck her with both simplicity and profundity. Power is not measured by what others see, but by what cannot be taken, controlled, or silenced. As she descended to the courtyard, the village awakening around her, Amara felt a profound shift in her understanding of herself. She had inspired the air, bent the currents to her will, and achieved what many had thought impossible. But now she saw that her greatest triumph lay not in her flight alone, but in what that flight represented. Each gust of wind that carried her, each swirl of air she had learned to command, was an extension of her inner fortitude. The more she trusted herself, the more she embraced her courage, the more the world responded. Nature itself had become a reflection of her resilience, a partner in her reclamation of freedom. Amara began to notice the villagers watching her in awe, their expressions a mixture of fear, wonder, and admiration. Even those who had once doubted her, who had whispered of limits and consequences, could not ignore the truth of her abilities. The elders, who had sought to suppress her from the beginning, now felt a quiet unease, recognizing that their efforts had not merely failed, but had illuminated the depth of her power. She understood that her presence, her very defiance, carried an influence far beyond the tangible. Her courage had become contagious, her resilience a living example, and her capacity to rise a challenge to the old order that had sought to contain her. With this realization, Amara felt an even greater calling. Her flight was no longer just for herself, it was a message, a beacon for anyone who had been silenced, restrained, or dismissed. She imagined the children in the village, eyes wide with wonder, seeing her above the rooftops and understanding that limits could be defied. She imagined the women and men who had been taught to fear their own gifts, who had hidden their talents out of shame or fear, and she felt a surge of responsibility. Her power was not only in what she could do, but in what she could inspire others to believe, that courage, resilience, and self-belief could lift anyone, regardless of the chains imposed by fear or oppression. Amara's stepmother, standing at the edge of the crowd, now understood that her attempts to break the girl had failed in the most complete way imaginable. It was not the absence of wings that defined Amara's strength, but the indomitable spirit she had nurtured in silence. Every trial, every moment of despair, every whispered lesson from the winds in the tower had combined to forge a power that could not be clipped, chained, or diminished. Amara's true wings were invisible, yet infinitely more potent than any physical appendage. As she lifted her arms and let the currents rise around her once more, she smiled, feeling the wind respond eagerly. She had learned the ultimate truth: freedom and power do not come from what is taken or given, but from what one nurtures within. Wings could be broken, but resilience could not. Strength could be denied, but courage persisted. And inspiration, once sparked, could spread beyond any barrier. With her heart full and spirit unbound, Amara soared above the village, not just as a girl who could fly, but as a symbol of unbreakable power, hope, and the extraordinary potential that lies within every soul determined to rise. The sun had barely risen over the village when Amara appeared on the horizon, gliding effortlessly above the rooftops. Her presence was impossible to ignore. The villagers, tending to their daily chores, froze mid-step, mouths opening in awe as they followed her graceful path through the sky. For weeks, rumors of her confinement, her clipped wings, and her supposed powerless state had spread like wildfire. Many had believed the elders' stories, assuming that the girl who once soared freely had been tamed, subdued, and broken. But there she was, defying every expectation, her movements bold and commanding, her mastery over the wind undeniable. The village square, usually filled with the noise of market activity and the hum of conversation, grew eerily quiet as Amara descended. Children clutched their mothers' hands, gasping at the sight of her hovering above them. Farmers dropped their tools in astonishment, and even the elders who had once orchestrated her grounding stepped back in disbelief. They had expected submission, fear, and obedience. Instead, they were confronted with power and freedom, living and tangible, swirling around them with every beat of the invisible currents that lifted her. Amara landed gently in the center of the square, the wind swirling at her command, teasing loose strands of her hair and rustling the cloth of her simple tunic. Her eyes swept over the crowd, meeting the fearful, shocked, and awed gazes of the villagers. She could see the tension in the elders' faces, the unease of those who had once whispered behind closed doors about how to control her, and she felt the weight of her triumph, not in anger but in the quiet strength of presence. She was no longer a girl to be tamed. She was a force, a symbol, a declaration that she could not be contained. The elders attempted to step forward, their robes flapping in the wind that seemed to respond only to Amara's intent. They opened their mouths, perhaps to speak, to remind her of her place, to command obedience, but she raised a hand, halting them with an invisible authority that went beyond fear. The air around her pulsed with energy, a subtle but undeniable force that reminded everyone present that power was not always physical, that strength often lay in spirit, courage, and mastery of what others could not comprehend. Amara spoke then, her voice carried on the wind, amplified not by her vocal cords but by the energy she had learned to command. "You tried to clip my wings," she said, her tone calm yet filled with undeniable authority, "but you cannot clip courage, resilience, or the will to rise. You cannot control what lives within, for my spirit belongs to no one but myself." The words reverberated through the square, resonating with villagers who had never dared speak against the elders, who had felt the weight of authority and fear pressing on them for generations. As she spoke, she lifted slightly, riding the currents above the square, demonstrating her mastery, her ability to ascend without wings. The villagers gasped, some falling to their knees in astonishment, others craning their necks to follow her every movement. Amara's flight was no longer a personal act. It had become a symbol of liberation, a tangible reminder that oppression and fear could be challenged, that control could be defied, and that courage could soar even in the face of those who sought to suppress it. Children began pointing and laughing with delight, inspired by the spectacle, their imaginations ignited by the possibility of freedom. Women and men whispered to one another, their eyes alight with hope and recognition, seeing in Amara's defiance a reflection of the strength that had always lain dormant in themselves. Even the elders, though their faces remained stern, could not deny the truth. The girl they had sought to subdue had transcended their limitations, and her flight was a testament to power beyond authority, beyond fear, and beyond their control. Amara descended slowly to the ground once more, letting the wind settle around her like a cloak, and looked directly at the elders. "Let this be a lesson," she said, her tone gentle but unwavering, "that no one can take what is born of courage and heart. Power is not given, it is claimed. Freedom is not asked for, it is taken. And defiance is a right that no one can deny." The villagers erupted in applause, shouts of amazement echoing through the square. Amara's flight had become more than a display of skill. It was a declaration, a challenge, and an inspiration. She had returned not as a victim, not as a subdued girl, but as a living symbol of liberation. And in that moment, above the rooftops and in the hearts of all who watched, Amara's defiance took flight, carrying with it the promise that no one could ever ground the spirit of a soul determined to rise.